Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I am Dr. Fauzia Osman, and I am an educational development consultant with the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning. One of my primary practices at the Institute is to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives across our teaching and learning communities here at Calgary. So I'm here today to talk to you about moving beyond celebrating diversity and towards anti-racist teaching. So I really would like to extend my gratitude to the Cummings School of Medicine. Kenna and Daniel, thank you so much for having me here today to talk to you all about anti-racist teaching practices. And thank you to all the participants that are here today, taking time out of your Friday afternoon, that to your lunch break, to be here with me to get on this learning journey. So welcome to you all. Before we get started, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now for today's session, which is going to be an hour long, I would really like for this to be an interactive session, as we are going to be exploring ways on how we can make our teaching practice, our pedagogical practice, more inclined towards anti-racism. I will be posing certain questions and prompts along the way for you to reflect on, not just from your teaching practice, but also on yourself and your own position and positionality as we move along. So there are three objectives that I would like for us to achieve from today's session. And that is, first of all, to identify the basic tenets of diversity in teaching and anti-racist teaching, but also to reflect on our own positionality and our practice from an anti-racist lens. Third, it's to discuss strategies to embed anti-racist practices within teaching at the individual and at the institutional levels. Now, before we proceed further, just wanted to let you know that this session is going to be recorded, but there will be opportunities for you to get into small breakout rooms and get into small group discussions. For that time, the recording will be paused, so you can get into some meaningful discussions with your fellow participants. Now, as we're going to be talking about racism and anti-racism, we know that these are not easy topics to engage with. They are controversial and they are sensitive in nature. And given that it's the month of February, the Black History Month, and we've had amazing workshops and webinars that have taken place throughout the month. And I'm sure that most of you have attended those sessions as well. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing here today will sound familiar, but if it doesn't, that's okay. And I would like to initiate by creating a safe space and invite you all to maintain that safe space for yourself and your fellow colleagues as we go along. So essentially, just to remember that, as we engage in this topic, to listen and engage from a place of honesty, openness, and compassion. And mainly by honesty, I mean to be honest with ourselves, especially when we are going to engage in some critical self-reflection, because we are going to think about ourselves in new and different ways. Secondly, to practice empathy. We're all learning, we're all evolving, and we're all on this journey of learning, and we're all at different stages of our learning process as well. So I would encourage you to practice empathy with your coworkers and with your fellow participants here as well. And lastly, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Folks, we know that growth happens when we step out of our comfort zone. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing here today may not resonate with you, or it may cause a certain level of discomfort. And if that happens, that is good. That means that learning is happening. Learning and unlearning is taking place. So I would highly encourage you to go ahead and embrace that discomfort in this learning process. So I would like to start off with a short incident or story, you can say, from my own personal experience. As you know, I mentioned my name is Fauzia Osman, and it's often that I have people don't get my name correct in the first instance, and I can understand that. Um, and it just reminds me of my days when back in my undergrad days, when I was an international student and new to the Western culture and to the Western ways, I would say. And this is about 20 years ago. But I was an international student in the state of Missouri in the US. And it was often that in my learning spaces, specifically at university or in the classroom, that a lot of my professors would not get my name right. And there were times that some professors didn't even bother. They would just, refer to me by pointing their pen or pencil or whatever instrument they had in their hand. And they just never bothered to learn my name. But there was this one professor, I took his class, and it was an elective class. I mean, my major was education, but his class was earth sciences. And he really made an attempt to learn my name, and he phonetically spelled out my name. No one had ever done that. And he was the first person to do so. And he phonetically spelled out my name the way it is spelled out here on this slide. And by the third week of the term, he made sure to get my name right. So he would say Fauzia, like he would make sure that he got it right every time. And it may seem minimal, but that whole process, that the fact that he cared enough to do that, it just really had me feel like I was being seen and heard in his classroom, in that environment. And I wouldn't really feel that in other classrooms or with other professors. But when he attempted to do that, it was the first time that I actually felt like I was being seen and heard in his classroom. And it made a big difference in my learning process as well. I gave much more to his class than I did to my other classes during that year. So it just to let you know that it really makes a difference when we make an attempt to learn something or to show genuine interest in another person's in another person's interest or background. But even 20 years down the line now, I see that this is something that a lot of international students are still struggling with, even here on our campus at U Calgary. So which is why I'm very passionate about diversity and around anti-racist teaching practices, and which is why I'm here today. So let's begin by talking about diversity in teaching. Well, what do we understand by this term? Diversity, as defined by the Association of American Colleges and University, says that diversity is individual differences, such as personality, learning styles, and life experiences, and group or social differences, such as race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and even our religious affiliation, that can be engaged in the service of learning. Now, the next step to diversity basically being acknowledging differences, the next step to that is inclusion, which is the active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity in people, in the curriculum, in the co-curriculum, and in the communities with which individuals might connect in ways that increase one's awareness, content knowledge, cognitive sophistication, and empathetic understanding of the complex ways individuals interact with and change systems and institutions. So like I said, diversity is about acknowledging those differences, but inclusion is going a step further by incorporating those differences within our practices. So there's certain principles to diversity in teaching, and what that entails is that engagement with the differences that we have in our teaching and learning contexts. There needs to be consistent communication between yourself and your students. It's the development of a learning community where your students feel safe in a learning environment where they can thrive. And in that process, knowing that your students come from various backgrounds, from different backgrounds, to adapt and to be flexible in your content and in designing your content and in your teaching practice. And lastly, to make learning accessible to all of your students, and not just for a specific group of students, but making sure that it's accessible for all of your students, regardless of their social identities. Now that is, diversity in teaching in a nutshell, but moving towards anti-racist teaching. Now we cannot talk about anti-racist teaching unless we acknowledge what racism and anti-racism is. So just to go over, briefly go over what racism is, as we all know that racism is a system of power that structures opportunity and assigns value based on the social construct of race, where privilege is afforded to whiteness. Racism is a system that unfairly disadvantages people of color while subsequently unfairly advantaging white people. And it's important to understand that in this system of the oppressive system of racism, the strong element here is power. Now, what do we mean by power in this instance? Well, power is the ability to decide who will access resources. And by resources, I mean the basic essentials we need in order to thrive in our society. So this includes education, healthcare, food security, housing, and so forth. And to have control over the access of these resources is where power really lies. And also the capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others, oneself, and the course of events. Now, on the other end of that spectrum is oppression, a system that devalues, undermines, marginalizes, and disadvantages people based on their social identities with the intent to benefit the dominant group. Now, oppression can occur on different levels and in different systems, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first of all, as I mentioned, that there are four dimensions of racism, really, right? And it perpetuates in these four different ways. First of all is internalized racism. And what that essentially is when consciously or subconsciously someone has negative ideas about themselves and their race or culture. These negative images come from racist ideas and images put out in society claiming that white people are superior. Basically, this is someone who feels that their race or culture is bad, or at least not as good as the white culture or race. Moving forward, then we have interpersonal, which is also known as individual racism. Now, this is very easily depicted. This is something that's commonly depicted through our media, social media, or even in our, in our daily lives, right? It's easy to spot, basically. Interpersonal racism is when an individual shows negative ideas or actions towards another race or culture, not their own. All types of people have these attitudes, but these attitudes are most obvious in the white dominated society that we live in. Then we come to institutional racism, which is the laws and practices that institutions create in order to benefit white people at the expense of people of color. And the outcomes of these policies and practices always have negative effects on people of color. And institutional racism is different from interpersonal and internalized racism because it does not just affect one person, but it affects large groups of people at once. And an example of this is the random checks at the airport. And unfortunately, I've been experiencing that for the last 20 years. But that is just an example of how institutional racism could work. And it's evident across many agencies and industries in our society. And then lastly, we have systemic racism. This is where racism occurs at the societal and the organizational level, giving rise to the other forms of racism. It trickles down into these other layers that I talked about earlier. Now, the thing with systemic racism is that it's often pervasive and it's very subtle. So it's hard to spot, like, as it is with interpersonal racism. And it is heavily embedded in societal and institutional policies, regulations, legislations, and ideologies that perpetuate racial disadvantage. So now that we know racism perpetuates at these different dimensions, at these different levels, I would like for us to pause here and reflect on our own practice, or the fact that are we cognizant of how racism perpetuates at these different levels? Really ask yourself, how does racism show up in my surrounding, in my daily environment, at my workplace or at the university, within my field? And then I would really like for you to ask yourself, what can I do to disrupt that? And really hold on to that question as we move along throughout today's session. So now looking at anti-racism in Calgary, we all know that over the last couple of months, in fact, since summer 2020, and as my friend would like to call it, that was the year of pandemic and protests. So when we had multiple protests here in Calgary in regards to the tragedy that occurred with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And it was hard for a lot of industries, well, not industries, sorry, organizations to not take notice, right? And even the city of Calgary held a public hearing, which lasted for 3 days. So even here at the University of Calgary, a lot of our leaders came forward, pledging their commitment to anti-racism and even denouncing racism in all forms. And I think even Cummings School of Medicine did the same, along with so many other faculties. So we did turn to social media as well. I remember that this tweet came out in June 2020, where we stated that the University of Calgary denounces anti-Black racism and racism in all forms. We're committed to creating an environment where all are valued and included on campus and in society as a whole. If you need support, please reach out. We stand with you in these difficult times. Now, I remember when this tweet came out, but within minutes and hour, there was just so much of retaliation and pushback in response to this tweet by U Calgary. So I've just highlighted a few over here for the purpose of today's session. And of course, I've erased the names of the people that have tweeted this for confidentiality purposes, obviously. But there are a few here that I would like to read out loud to just kind of amplify the message of what we're talking about. So to begin with, can we hear the university explicitly say the words Black Lives Matter? And let's hear more about how you'll promote and support anti-racism initiatives within the university and your BIPOC faculty, staff, and students. I think this tweet is cute. However, it does little to actually combat the internal structures that allow for systemic and institutionalized racism that exists at the U of C. And lastly, you can't meaningfully address racism while avoiding naming it. What is the difficulty? Enacted by whom? Creating an anti-racist environment? How? Reaching out to which available experience anti-racist support? So legit questions, and these came from our campus community members. So it really has you thinking that, okay, there is racism here, right here at home, at U Calgary, at our university, but how does it show up? What does it look like? So what might racism look like in a post-secondary teaching and learning context? And there were some other tweets that came about that address this question really. And I've highlighted again a few here, and I'm not going to read all of these, but just one or two to again stress on how racism shows up in our classrooms. First, I know two of your professors who openly said the N-word during class without a care for your Black students, who also pay thousands to this university. A complaint about the teacher was sent, and the person that brought it to light was threatened with a slander case. It is unfair for you to tweet this out without educating your professors how harmful that can be. This is not a safe space, and you need to do something about it. And lastly, additionally, the other was a professor, and after dropping the N-word, 40% of the class dropped the class. Either way, what are your plans to discourage the notion that slurs are okay when they are educational? And there were so many other tweets that highlighted areas around the lack of diversity in faculty in their faculty. And there were other tweets that also talked about the overrepresentation of whiteness across the university and in different departments. And there were so many other tweets about microaggressions that happened not just in the classroom, but within other spaces on campus. So we know that it's happening here. And now that we are looking into anti-racist teaching practices, it's important for us to understand what are we really up against, right? What is it that we are trying to counter through this practice? So now, when we're looking at anti-racism teaching practices and anti-racism pedagogy, essentially, what is anti-racism? What do we mean by this term? Well, it's acknowledging and confronting institutional and systemic racism and the other isms or the other oppressive systems that hinder our society from truly reflecting its citizenry and values. So anti-racism is actively working towards dismantling of oppressive mindsets, attitudes, policies, legislation, practices, and systems. And it's countering that with anti-racism. Anti-racism is basically countering racism with anti-racist practices. It's important to understand that anti-racism takes a structural approach and ensures that institutional and individual level strategies address systemic racism. So what you were engaged with earlier in terms of your small group discussions, that is part of anti-racist work, where you are examining the systemic barriers and thinking of ways of how you could dismantle those oppressive systems. So anti-racism, like I said, it's going against an oppressive system, the oppressive system being racism itself. But that is just one part of what exists in our society. We have many other oppressive systems, such as sexism, genderism, ableism, and so forth. But for the purpose of today's session, we're just focusing on anti-racism, which again is under the umbrella of anti-oppression. So let's move right into it. What does an anti-racist approach to teaching and learning entail? For that, folks, it's really about decentering of whiteness. But before I go further into this, what is your understanding of whiteness? How would you describe whiteness in one or two words? And feel free to respond in using the chat box. What do you think the term whiteness means? Yeah, so absolutely privilege, dominant narrative, privilege based on skin color. Yes, unexamined, the ocean we swim in. Absolutely. So all of these are great. And thank you again for your responses. Whiteness really is a culture that is embedded in the concept of white supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I'm not referring to like the KKK or something as extreme as that. But white supremacy is essentially a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, and therefore white people should be dominant over other races. Now, in understanding white supremacy or critiquing white supremacy, we have to understand that it's not going against the white race. It's not critiquing white individuals or white people as a whole, but rather a system that places whites above everyone else. And that's exactly what white supremacy is. So decentering whiteness is a way of how we can achieve anti-racist pedagogy and anti-racist teaching. What that would require is for us to engage with the following. First of all, examining what it means to be white and your relationship with the systems of power. Now, remember we talked about power being a key component when it comes to racism. To uphold that oppressive system, it has to be placed in power. So it's important for us to examine our relationships with those systems of power to understand where our privileges really lie. To reflect upon the role of whiteness in your learning environment. And this shows up in many different ways, right? Such as the overrepresentation of whiteness within the faculty, the representation of whiteness in our curriculum, and even within our classrooms, such as in our grading or assessment practices. And lastly, to move towards centering the experiences of your students. So decentering whiteness is about moving away from whiteness and centering the curriculum or the content around the students' experiences. It's important that the students' experiences are reflected in what they're learning so that they're able to contextualize this and apply in their own lives. Now, in order to do that, excuse me. So in order to do that, it's important that we develop a racial equity lens. So what does this really mean? Well, basically a racial equity lens in a university setting is where we ask questions when a department, or rather we reflect on a set of questions when a department, faculty, or the university is developing a strategic direction or evaluating policies, programs, and or decisions. So some key questions that we would ask ourselves along the way is, are we considering the experiences and perspectives of the racially diverse administrators, faculty, staff? Are their experiences reflected in our curriculum, in our pedagogical practices, in our policies? Next, do our policies, processes, programs result in racial equitable or inequitable outcomes? Are we moving towards racial equity or are we moving away from it? And that's how we kind of evaluate our policies and practices, including our processes. So racial equity lens helps us to identify and weigh challenges and possibilities in order to take intentional steps to ensure that equitable outcomes for students, faculty, and staff is achieved. Now, in order to do this, it's important that we engage in some homework. We need to do our work uh, around educating ourselves and to develop a racial equity lens. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this that's mentioned on the slide, but this was taken from the insidehighered.com. And it basically talks about developing a racial equity lens at an institutional level, or rather departmental level, and also at the individual level. And I'm going to unpack this further as we move along. But like I said earlier, there are four dimensions of racism. But when it comes to post-secondary teaching and learning, we're looking at the individual, the interpersonal, and also the institutional racism and how that perpetuates. So folks, what does anti-racist pedagogy really include? Well, it includes the following. First of all, examining theory, structure, and the practice of racism and power relations embedded in history and academics discipline. Now, we know that there's certain structures and systems that we have in our society that were built on white supremacist values, education being one of them. And, the example of residential schools is a prime example. And this is also evident in our higher education institutions as well. But the trickling effects of that is seen even today. It's important that we raise self-awareness of social locations and knowledge production. And by this, it's again focusing on ourselves, engaging in critical self-reflection, identifying ourselves, our experiences, our positionality, because eventually that impacts how we interpret and disseminate knowledge as well. To empower students by validating and acknowledging their everyday experiences. As I mentioned earlier, that the student experiences need to be reflected in our curriculum, in the content that we teach, and fostering critical thinking. And by that, I mean, it's not necessarily teaching them what to think, but rather how to think and how to engage with these different layers that currently exist. And creating a sense of community in the classroom. Now, this is where we would need to create an egalitarian space within our classroom to ensure that our students are feeling safe and can be included in their learning process. And then lastly, to develop skills for anti-racist methodologies in the classroom. Again, this is kind of decentering ourselves from whiteness and moving towards anti-racist methodologies, which is an inclusive process that takes students' experiences into consideration. And I've talked about, looking at our own positionality, and that's what I would like for us to do here. I would really like for us to shift gears a little bit and to turn this inward and to really bring ourselves into this work. So I would like for us to really focus on our identities, who we are, and to really label that so that we can understand where our privileges or disadvantages even lie. Here's my example. So I've listed a few of my social identities that I go by. And as you will note that some of these that are listed here, I have faced disadvantages and discrimination based on certain identities, but I've also faced advantages and privileges in my life due to the many intersections of my social identity. So my lived experiences of discrimination and racism have made me relate and empathize with a large number of people who face the effects of discrimination and racism due to the multiple intersections of their social identity. So where we are, like in terms of our social identities, we tend to develop a lens and how we view the world through that lens. So I would invite you to engage in this individual self-reflection activity, where I would like for you to think about your own identities. How do you identify yourself? And I've got a list of social identities listed here on the left, but how do you essentially identify yourself? And then reflect on the following. Which of your social group memberships were easiest to identify? Which of your social group memberships were most difficult to identify? And then once you're done with that, reflect on how this exercise might have enabled you to think about yourself in a new way. So I would really like for you to take maybe 30 to 40 seconds here and really think about, how do you identify, and how easy or difficult was it for you to identify yourself based on your social identities? So if you'd like to turn off your cameras, or whatever you need to just engage in this individual activity, you don't need to discuss this with anyone, but I would like for you to sit and think about it for at least maybe 30 seconds or so. As you all would know, being in the area of teaching and learning, it's essential that we engage in these critical self-reflection activities from time to time. And by reflecting on our own intersecting identities, along with the oppression and privileges that it might lead to, it helps us understand our lived experiences better and why we hold values and perceptions the way we do. So it also helps us identify how we place ourselves in society in relation to others, which is also known as positionality. So our positionality is what influences how we interpret and disseminate knowledge, informing our role as an educator. So when we talk about the shift of moving from celebrating diversity towards anti-racist teaching, what that essentially is that while we're acknowledging the differences of our students and the varied backgrounds that they might represent, anti-racist teaching is more about moving towards distribution of power. Now, remember, as an educator, you do hold a position of power in your teaching and learning environment. And going back to the definition that we were talking about earlier in regards to power, it's where you control certain resources. It's also where how you influence others' behaviors or a series of events. And as an educator, as a professor or as a sessional instructor, or anyone teaching in a classroom, you hold that position of power. So anti-racist teaching really requires you to make a shift in that power, to distribute that power amongst your students. So it doesn't just lie with you, but you're rather empowering your students to take on to take on ownership of their learning process as well. So as we're making that shift, moving from acknowledging diversity towards anti-racism and anti-racist teaching, I would like to pose these questions again to you, and I would like for you to think about this. In your own classroom, how can I become more aware of my own unconscious bias? We all hold biases, right? But what are some ways that we can be more aware of them so that we can mitigate that in our own classroom practices? Which groups of students might I see through a deficit lens? Now, some of these questions really would require you to be honest with yourselves. Like I said earlier, as we started the session, it's important that we're honest. We all hold prejudice and biases, but we really have to call ourselves out on that. Like, where does our lens take us, and how do we view certain groups of people, and how might this even show up in our classrooms? Whose voices dominate in my class? And lastly, how and why do I choose my class resources, such as the stock images, the reading, the group names? Why am I choosing one author over the other? Why am I choosing one side of history to be taught as opposed to the other? Who's given importance in my class? What knowledge is given importance in my class? So these are some questions that we need to think about as we engage with anti-racist teaching practices. Now, how do we take this into our classroom? We talked about anti-racist pedagogy and looking at anti-racist principles, but how does this translate into our own classroom practices? So here are some practical tips and guides that you can walk away with for now. And it's simple things, really, to begin with. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it, right? There's nothing wrong with apologizing. knowing that, we're all learning, we're all evolving. So to show ourselves, that compassion and grace by allowing ourselves to learn from our mistakes and to move along in our learning process. To strive to create an environment that's based on equity and equality, not assumptions and stereotypes, to work towards subverting them in your own consciousness. Next, to allow students to lead the class discussion more. Again, this comes back to that whole empowerment piece, right? Where students are taking ownership of their own learning experience. This can make them feel more invested in the education process, and it creates an egalitarian learning environment that is safe for all your students. And the distribution of power amongst your students, uh, you're distributing that power amongst your students rather than just keeping it to yourself. Next, engaging in critical self-reflection often. I've stressed this throughout today's session, that it's essential, it's critical that we get into self-reflection from time to time, acknowledging our biases and working towards mitigating them in your practice. And then lastly, monitor the way you speak, avoiding using racist slurs or, culturally insensitive language. And I usually get, my colleagues say, well, Faza, that's stating the obvious. And absolutely it is. But as we have come to know through some of those tweets, that it is happening within our classrooms where these microaggressions are very evident and prominent, and it can have a detrimental effect on students, specifically in terms of their learning, and even can impact their mental health. Next is to learn your students' names. I cannot stress this enough. This is something that I speak to from my own personal experience. It's so important to just show your students that you care. Ask them how to pronounce their names and to say that correctly. As my grandmother used to say, the most beautiful sound to a person is the sound of their name. And to see that somebody gets it right or attempts to get it right, I think there's absolutely nothing like that. So. And to be purposeful in the assignments that you set for your students, set clear expectations for projects and assignments, and ensure that the rubrics do reflect those. Next, be humble, right? Exercise intellectual humility. If you don't know something, that's fine. You can let your students know and then follow up with an answer later on. The next is avoid tokenizing marginalized students. This, it's very, again, it can have such a negative impact on your students because in that instance, it's otherizing or targeting people by singling them out for a comment on sensitive subjects or, sensitive topics by really putting them, in the spotlight. And in some instances, is also asking them to relive their trauma, specifically with your marginalized students, which is something that you don't want to do. So if your students offer a position, great, but if they don't, then it's important that you don't seek an opinion from them. And like I said, going back to my own personal experience as an international student in the state of Missouri, now this was back in 20 years ago, and sadly the tragic events of 9/11 had happened. But I found out very quickly that in most spaces, including my classrooms, I took on this spokesperson for the Muslim world, a role that, my professors would just kind of put me on the spot and ask me for my opinion on everything that was going on in the Muslim world. And it was very frustrating and very annoying. And it really, really did have an impact on my learning experience as well. And then next is folks create, there we go. Create and build a community of inquiry, a community of practice. Now, I know that most of what I've shared here today may seem daunting, it may seem overwhelming, but the good thing is that you don't have to do this alone, right? Get together and collaborate with your fellow practitioners, with your coworkers, anyone that shares similar interests or has the same kind of passion that you do. Work together, learn together, grow together, where you can share materials, educate each other, and provide each other with constructive feedback. And lastly, educate yourself. There is so much available out there in terms of the material in regards to anti-racism and anti-racist teaching. I mean, in this day and age, it's merely an excuse, right? Like if we say that I don't know anything about a certain topic, because there's just a wealth of knowledge and information that's available to us. And even though this term anti-racism has been kind of amplified, I would say, over the last year, especially here in Calgary, folks, this work has been around for decades. There is significant scholarship, literature, research around this area that is available for you to engage with. And I've listed a couple of scholars here who are engaged with this kind of work. And the first one being Dr. Melinda Smith, who is the VP for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the university. There is also Shireen Razak, who writes extensively around colonial violence against Indigenous people, specifically around Indigenous women. There's also George Day, who talks about anti-racist approaches in education, and specifically around anti-colonial thought. And then lastly, there is Robin DiAngelo, who writes extensively around the concept of whiteness. And she was the one who coined the term white fragility. She has a whole book around it, which I would highly recommend if you haven't read that. But yeah, these are some of the scholars who have done significant work in the area of anti-racism. So, excuse me. And so here I've just kind of picked out a few readings and materials for you to engage with if you're just starting off on this journey. The first two are TED Talks. The first one is really looking at, anti-racism versus non-racism. But the second one, why is it so hard to talk about the N-word, is specifically around the use of N-word within the post-secondary teaching and learning context. And there are some books that I've listed on there as well. And those are all great reads, but one book that I would really like to highlight is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, who was a critical pedagogue. And this book is from the 1970s, but I continue to revisit it from time to time. And I think everything that's discussed in that book is something that's applicable even today. So I would highly recommend you to gain access to that book and include that in your personal library if you can. So the importance of continuing this work, folks. Why are we doing this, right? Excuse me. Well, first of all, I think I mentioned this earlier as we started this presentation, the fact that you are here on a Friday afternoon, taking time out of your lunch break to learn more about how to make your classrooms more inclusive and move towards anti-racist teaching shows that you have a genuine interest and that you genuinely care for your students, that you're involved with this work and your commitment to anti-racism. So without enacting these changes, the unseen silence will further reinforce a sense of complicity that undermines the work and commitment to inclusion and safe spaces in our campus community. Challenging racial injustice and supporting the ongoing development of an inclusive and safe environment is a necessity in these times, since post-secondary education is a space for all to learn and grow. And therefore, as a post-secondary institution that has earned a reputation of high standards in teaching and learning, it is simply a first step to acknowledge the lived experiences of those in our campus community. But now is the time for that to be followed with action. And we have been engaging with that over the last couple of months. Therefore, strategies devised and discussed here today serve as a pivotal platform for promoting anti-racism throughout the teaching and learning communities on your campus. So this is something that you can walk away with, not just to apply within your own classrooms, but also to think about how we can apply this across the different and various teaching and learning spaces that we have on our campus. So as we get done here for today, I always find this quote very fascinating, that it's not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences, right? And I would really like for you to leave here today knowing that, again, as an educator, you hold a position of power. You do have certain privileges. It's really up to you. How do you use that privilege to empower your students within your classroom? You are an agent for change, right? And as we're moving towards anti-racism work could look different in so many different settings. But within the setting of teaching and learning, within this context of post-secondary education, it is moving towards an anti-racist pedagogy to decenter whiteness and to focus our content and our curriculum that is reflective of our students' experiences. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your participation here today. Again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. Really appreciate it. I've shared my contact information here. I would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions. If you would like to take this conversation further outside of this session, I welcome that opportunity too. Well, thank you so much again for having me, and thank you for everyone that's here today. Really appreciate you taking the time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Take care, be well, and have a great weekend. Thank you.